It's not just that this lake has so many species of cichlids, it's how diverse they are, how many different ways in which they make a living. This fish over here is Pseudotrophaeus elongatus, and it makes a living by scraping the algae off rocks and combing through it. This one does the same, except it has an even more elaborate mouth. It has its teeth arranged rather like a rasp, with lots of little teeth which it files away and scrapes the algae off the rocks. This fish here buries its head in the sand, opens its mouth, and gobbles up little chironomid midges that are living there. And this thing is the most remarkable cichlid of all, Rhamphochromys. It is the uber predator, the Tyrannosaurus rex of the lake, gobbling up anything that it can with those formidable sharp teeth. What's so amazing about these fish is that they are all descended from one cichlid that entered this lake about 2 million years ago. 0 to 600 fish in about 2 million years. It's one of the most astonishing evolutionary events that has ever happened on this planet.
By the end of the 1950s, evolution had a new formula. A combination of natural selection, isolation, Mendelian inheritance, and mathematical theory.
All these fish, I've got to say, they look...
It was called the Neo-Darwinian synthesis.
The formula wasn't entirely Darwinian, but that didn't matter. On the centenary of the origin of species, everyone agreed that Darwin's vision had triumphed. Everyone was a Darwinian. You could almost say that they were more Darwinian than Darwin himself.
And yet, as Darwinism entered its second century, some anomalies remained. Natural selection may have triumphed, yet some animal behaviors were still hard to explain in terms of natural selection. Such as altruism. In a world driven by competition, why are some animals altruistic? Termites, for instance, cooperate relentlessly, building vast mounds on the African plain.
A termite mound is filled with millions of altruists. The soldiers and workers whose lives are devoted to defending and feeding the queen. They are the eunuchs of the termite state, and their existence is surprisingly hard to explain.
According to Darwinian logic, creatures are engineered by natural selection to increase their chances of reproduction. Yet, most termites are sterile. They don't reproduce at all. They work for the colony, apparently without reward. Why? In 1964, a zoologist, Bill Hamilton, proposed a solution to the problem of altruism, one that explained the existence of social insects.
This highly regimented move by hundreds of thousands of individuals is a typically impressive achievement of the social insects. No leader...
Hamilton realized that the members of any colony are very closely related. And as such, they shared genes.
The queen alone is replicating the genes of the colony on its behalf.
That, said Hamilton, is the key. If your altruistic act benefits a relative, then you may pay a cost. But at least some of your genes will reap the benefit. Natural selection does not count the fates of individuals. It counts the fates of genes. Termite soldiers sacrifice themselves for their queen because she shares many of their genes. And by devoting their lives to her, more of her genes, and hence their genes, are passed on than they could possibly achieve by themselves. This was a radical extension of Darwinism, and it spawned a new science. At Harvard, E.O. Wilson gave it a name, sociobiology. At Oxford, Richard Dawkins gave it a slogan, the selfish gene. Wherever sociobiologists looked, they explained all the strange things animals do as the product of natural selection, not on individuals, but on their genes.
Each individual is just obeying its own genes.
And humans, they said, are no different. Our behaviors, too, can be explained by genetic programs shaped by natural selection.
This is the fundamental principle of sociobiology. The genes for particular social behaviors exist.
Applied to humans, sociobiology seems excessively reductive. But there's no doubt that as an explanation of animal behavior, it triumphed. And sociobiology's triumph was the triumph of natural selection. A force that in Darwin's time seemed weak and ephemeral was now omnipotent and omnipresent. Yet Darwin gave us more than natural selection, more than a mechanism of evolution. He also gave us a new narrative, or at least the promise of one. He told us that the history of life was a tale of epic forces and scales, and that it was ours to discover. If there is an icon of Darwin's theory, it is this. A metaphor for all evolutionary history. A tree.
The twigs, Darwin said, were species, and they were connected to their ancestors by branches, and those ancestors to theirs reaching deep into the past, so that the whole history of life could be represented as a great tree.
Darwin first conceived this image in 1837. He sketched a simple tree-like diagram to show how lineages could originate from a single source and then diverge and proliferate. Above it, he scribbled the words, "I think." 22 years later, in The Origin, he confidently asserts that just such a tree could be constructed for any group of creatures.
Easy to say, hard to do, and Darwin didn't even try.
Why did Darwin, so bold and so visionary, not give us the history of life that his theory implied? Perhaps it was because he was so acutely aware of the deficiencies of the fossil record. The rocks sought to bear mute testimony to titanic conflicts playing out over eons of time. But, as Richard Owen had so cruelly exposed, the reality was rather different. Animal fossils were abundant, but there were also huge gaps. And nowhere was the gap greater than at the base of the Cambrian. That's when an explosion of animal life seems to have occurred. New species, entire faunas, emerged as if from nowhere, their ancestors absent.
Those rocks over there are Cambrian. That makes them around 525 million years old. And they contain animal life wonderful creatures such as brachiopods and ostracods and trilobites. These rocks are Precambrian. They're only about 30 million years older, and yet they are empty. There are no animal remains in them whatsoever. But how could this be? If these Precambrian rocks didn't have any fossils in them, where did the animals come from? Characteristically, Darwin didn't shirk the problem. During these vast and unknown periods of time, he wrote, the world must have swarmed with living creatures. That he couldn't produce them was, he admitted, a grave difficulty.
Darwin despaired of being able to reconstruct the history of life. Yet he did not doubt that his successors would do just that. And so they have. Enter one of Darwin's most ardent disciples. A young German scientist, Ernst Haeckel. Of all the scientists who followed Darwin, Haeckel was the most protean. A gifted artist who could reveal nature's exquisite geometries with the stroke of a pen. He was also a brilliant anatomist, devoting months to the study of obscure sea creatures. And he was a romantic, of the sentimental, nature-loving, Goethe-worshipping German kind. For Haeckel loved his cousin, Anna. She had golden hair and blue eyes. He described her as a true German child of the forest.
Haeckel was besotted with her and married her. What bliss! But for only a few months. And then she died.
Anna's death left Haeckel unhinged. He contemplated suicide, but then he found religion. Not the false consolations of Christianity, but the harsh, godless clarity of Der Darwinismus. He would become its greatest apostle. He would take the good book to the German masses. He would preach the truth. And he would do what Darwin had so conspicuously failed to do. He would rewrite the history of life.
But how? Haeckel needed a way of reconstructing the evolutionary past that did not rely on fossils. The answer, he said, was to look at the embryo.
The embryo of an animal is a record of its evolutionary past. And the earlier in development you look, the further back into that past you could see. The embryo, Haeckel said, is Ariadne's thread.
He began by comparing vertebrate embryos. Just before birth, they seem very different, as you'd expect. But follow the embryos back in time to when they are younger and less developed, they look remarkably alike. They have the same dorsal nerve cords, the same pharyngeal slits. But Haeckel looked further, deeper into the embryo, earlier into its development, before the limbs appear, before there's a head or a tail, and further yet, to when it is but a ball of cells with the beginnings of a gut. This is a stage of development called gastrulation, and here he thought he found something wonderful, the ancestor of us all.
Here, said Haeckel, is a remembrance, a recollection, a recapitulation of the very first animal. A creature, no more than a ball of flagellated cells that had once whirled through the Precambrian seas. He called it the gastria and said it was his most important discovery. Others said it was his most outrageous invention.
Haeckel used embryos to produce evolutionary trees. Lots of them. They look a bit like Darwin's tree, but they are not abstract metaphors. They are the first attempt to put every living thing in its evolutionary place. All the animals are there, in more or less the right order. And somewhere near the base of the trunk leading to all the other animals is the gastria, Haeckel's hypothetical ancestral beast. Haeckel's speculations were, no doubt, too bold. The embryo does not contain a simple picture of the history of life. And yet, there is no doubt that his guesses were, more often than not, inspired. Since the 1950s, a trickle of animal fossils has been emerging from Precambrian rocks. Some are little more than imprints, others are minute. But by using computer tomography imaging, even individual cells can be seen. And what's more, some of these proto-creatures are not so very different from Haeckel's gastria.
But there's another reason to think that animals lived long before the Cambrian, and that's because DNA tells us so.
When Watson and Crick elucidated the structure of DNA, they unified life.
The DNA story is without doubt one of the greatest success stories in the history of science, because it can't be often that two newcomers to a field make such a major discovery so quickly.
Nearly all living things use DNA as the stuff of inheritance, so they must all be related and descend, much as Darwin had supposed, from a single ancestor. But now we can go further. We can sequence the genome of any living thing and read it as if we were reading a book.
Genomes are documents written in billions of letters. They are palimpsests, endlessly augmented, erased, and rewritten by the hand of evolution. And if you can read them, you can read the history of life.
By sequencing genomes, we can now date the origin of animals in the tree of life. Some of them turn out to be astonishingly ancient. Perhaps the simplest of all animals is a microscopic creature called Trichoplax. Doesn't have a gut, a mouth, a brain, or even sense organs. Its genome suggests that its ancestors departed from the main trunk of animal evolution perhaps 1 billion years ago. Just as Darwin had supposed, there must have been animals in the Precambrian seas. The sequencing machines are revealing new branches on the tree of life. They are giving us a new historical narrative. But we are also discovering new fossils. And often, the story they tell is the same.
Consider the whale. Whales obviously evolved from some land mammal. But if so, where were the fossil half whales? Where were the whales with legs? By Darwin's logic, they must have existed and they must have been big. So where were they?
For years, the origin of whales was shrouded in obscurity. Not anymore. In recent decades, the fossil record has become wonderfully complete.
Just as Darwin had predicted, just as Darwin had hoped, we now have an astonishing array of fossils that show how a land mammal makes a transition to one that lives in the sea. They show how front limbs evolve into flippers and how hind limbs just wither away.
and how a whale comes to breathe not through nostrils and the tips of its snout, but rather a blowhole in the back of its head. And they show us one more thing. They tell us about the place of whales in the Tree of Life.
The evidence hinges literally on an ankle bone. For primitive whales, it turns out, have ankle bones that are remarkably similar to those of modern ungulates, such as cows, sheep and pigs. Yet we don't have to rely on fossilized bones to tell us about the ancestry of whales. We can use DNA too. And to do that, we have to go to Africa.
Compare the DNA of a cetacean to that of any other mammal, and something surprising emerges. Their closest living relative is this, a hippo.
It's not that whales evolved from hippos, or that hippos evolved from whales. Rather, it is simply that hippos and cetaceans are, as it were, cousins. They are descended from a common ancestor that lived perhaps 55 million years ago. It is precisely this sort of agreement between DNA and fossil evidence that makes the case for evolution so utterly compelling. And so, to the evolution of the one species we care about more than any other. One might have expected Darwin to say something about human evolution. And, in The Origin of Species, he does.
After 400 pages of ants and agoutis, bats and barnacles, the whole bestiary, in fact, right through to zebras, he settles down to consider humanity. And what he says is this: light will be thrown on the origin of man and his history. And that's it. Well, thanks for that, Charles.
Darwin, of course, knew we were descended from apes, but left others to spell it out. Among them, Ernst Haeckel. With a characteristic flourish, he imagined humanity like Botticelli's Venus, rising gloriously from the brutes that surround her. At the time, there were no fossils linking man to apes. And so he set to imagining what lay between.
No human fossils? No problem. Let's just invent one. Something between an ape and a man. Let's give it a name. Ape Man. Let's give it a real, proper Latin name. Pithecanthropus.
Like the gastria, Pithecanthropus was an invention, a hypothetical ancestor. Yet Haeckel's reasoning was sound. If we were descended from apes, then sooner or later, intermediates would be found.
In 1891, a Dutch physician, Eugene Dubois, digging in the banks of the Solo River in Java, discovered this skull cap. It wasn't human, it wasn't ape, it was an ape man. In homage to Haeckel, Dubois called it Pithecanthropus.
In the centuries since, Pithecanthropus has acquired a new name, Homo erectus, and has been joined by a collection of other fossils. Some apish humans, others human apes. The family tree of humanity can now be richly filled with species, and there's a clear and unambiguous line between the earliest apes and us, Homo sapiens. But which of the great apes, now alive, is our closest relation? That question, endlessly debated since Darwin's time, hasn't been answered by fossils. It required DNA. By comparing DNA sequences from each of the great apes, the order of evolutionary descent has become clear. We're genetically closest to chimpanzees and bonobos. 5 to 6 million years ago, our ancestor was theirs. 7 million years ago, we shared an ancestor with the gorilla. 12 million years ago, with an orangutan. And so on, back to the very beginning of life.
Who do you think you are? Asked Haeckel, and answered, you are an ape, a mammal, a reptile, a fish, a worm, a ball of cells, and finally a single cell floating in the saline womb of the primordial seas.
150 years ago, Darwin spoke of a time when the tree of life would be more than a metaphor, when it would be an accurate historical record. That time has come. The tree of life stands before us, its branches becoming clearer with every fossil and DNA sequence. And our species is but a leaf on a twig, buried within its vast and ramifying canopy. When we look at living things, it is the differences that we first see. The astonishing variety of form, color, and behavior. And yet, beneath this diversity runs a deep, unifying plan. For most animals have much the same geometry, the same basic body plan. For Darwin, this paradox of unity within diversity was the gift of the tree of life. The consequence of species giving rise to species, endlessly adapting over countless generations. But what Darwin could never have imagined is that such unity within diversity can be found in every cell, every molecule, and every gene of every living thing.
Well done, where's that? Can you look at the light? Where's my light? Where's that?
Ellie is a patient at Moorfields Hospital in London. She was born without irises. Her pupils are enormous, for they cannot contract, and she can barely see.
Good girl. Where's he gone now? Where's he gone now? Okay.
The disorder is called aniridia, and it's caused by a mutation that she inherited from her mother.
Well done. Oh, you get a lovely view of your eye. Oh, she's such a good girl. Good, well done.
In 1992, geneticists identified the mutant gene.
No, another one. Good, 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 good.
Located on chromosome 11, it's called PAX6.
Well done. Well done. Such a good girl.
PAX6 is a very special kind of gene. It's a molecular switch, a gene that turns other genes on and off. And this particular molecular switch is needed in the construction of the human eye. The really interesting bit, however, is what happens next.
In 1994, geneticists were studying fruit flies, searching for the genes that make its different organs. They screened thousands of flies for mutations that cause abnormality. Some of the mutant flies were blind. They had a mutation called eyeless. Normal flies have large red compound eyes. Eyeless flies have none. Analyzing the DNA of eyeless flies, they identified the mutant gene. It was PAC6, the same gene, or at least its fly version, that causes aniridia in humans.
I remember how amazed we all were when we heard about this result. Everyone just knew that human eyes and fly eyes had evolved independently. How could it be otherwise? They just looked so very different. But the discovery that they shared a gene told us that they shared an evolutionary history.
Geneticists started looking into the eyes of other animals. And wherever they looked, they found the same thing. The molecular circuit of which PAC6 is a part is universal. Eyes are so ubiquitous, so useful, and so various in their design that for most of the 20th century, zoologists had argued that they must have evolved many times. This, however, must be wrong. Eyes have evolved only once.
All the eyes belonging to all the animals on Earth can trace their origin to one very simple eye that belonged to one doubtless very simple creature that lived perhaps 1 billion years ago.
Here is another mutant fruit fly. Its eyes are quite normal, but it has an extra pair of legs where its antennae should be. And here's a different mutant. Instead of the usual 2 wings, it has 4. True, they're a little deformed, but they're definitely an extra set of wings. These flies have mutations in their Hox genes. Like PAC6, Hox genes are molecular switches that turn other genes on and off. They determine a fly's basic geometry, the number and position of its segments, limbs and wings. And like PAC6, Hox genes are universal. They can be found in all animals, including us.
Animal bodies seem so very different from each other, and yet they're not. A fly has wings and segments. We have arms and vertebrae. A facile comparison, you may think, until you look at the embryo.
This is a fruit fly embryo. And here, one by one, the Hox genes are being expressed. They ensure that every segment, head to tail, knows what structure to make. They work with the exquisite Boolean logic of a computer program, directing cells to their fates. And this is a human embryo. Again, the Hox genes are activated along the head-to-tail axis, ensuring that our parts are arranged in the right order and end up in the right place. The circuitry is more complex than a fruit fly's, but the logic is the same. The discovery that many important genes are shared across the animal kingdom was thrilling. A new science was born: evolutionary developmental biology, EVO-DEVO for short. Like Haeckel, we would delve into the embryo to unravel our evolutionary past. But now, instead of working out what our ancestors looked like, we'd work out the genetic programs that made them. Ivo Divo would explain how organic structures can be at once so similar and conservative, and yet so promiscuously different.
There is a paradoxical quality to genes. Look at any animal and you can see many of the same genes doing much the same thing. And yet, look at them closely. Look at them working in the embryo, and you can see the origins of all diversity.
This is the embryo of a tetrapod. As it grows, Hox genes switch on and off in a kaleidoscopic pattern. Molecular signals sweep across the limb buds, telling each cell what it is and what it must become. The cells of the limb condense into the outline of bones, and so a mole grows a paw. Another embryo, and the same thing happens, at least to begin with, but there's far more bone growth signal in this embryo. The bones of the limb grow longer, and the cells between the fingers do not die. They become webbing. And so a bat grows a wing. Two embryos that start their lives in much the same way, but with just a subtle shift in gene activity, become two very different creatures. I could tell many such stories about the evolution of beaks and feathers and scales and spots and snouts. But is it enough? Surely the point of science is not merely to tell stories, but rather to reveal the laws of nature. Haeckel believed that the symmetries shown by living things were caused by simple laws, not very different from those that explain the symmetries of crystals. Living things are, of course, much more complex than crystals, yet they do have a geometry, an internal one composed of vast and intricate networks of genes, proteins, and molecules, all working together to give life. Perhaps then, the war of nature is not simply a struggle among individuals or even genes, but a struggle among different ways of organizing life, a struggle among systems. In the short run, success depends on being robust, on being able to weather the vicissitudes of existence and then reproduce. In the long run, however, in the evolutionary long run, success needs something else. It needs flexibility, on being able to respond to a mutable and contingent world. Let me put it another way. In the short run, creatures evolve. In the long run, they evolve evolvability. About 1 billion years ago, a creature, something like Trichoplax, crawled out of the Precambrian ooze. Superficially, it may have been unremarkable, but it seems that there was something new and rather special about its genetic network. It had a structure that was robust enough to be strong, yet flexible enough to change. Over time, this way of organizing life was copied and modified countless times. Parts could be added, even rearranged, and yet the system as a whole would continue to work. It was an engine of innovation, and it went on to conquer the world. The theory of evolution by natural selection is one of the most beautiful products of science. It provided an answer, the only rational one we have, as to why living things bear the hallmarks of design.
It is so beguilingly simple, so powerful, and so manifestly true that it is easy to forget just how inadequate it is. There are so many questions that we can't answer. Why are there 600 species of cichlid in this lake, and not 60 or 6,000? Why are there no anglerfish cichlids, or flying fish cichlids, or cichlid sharks? What, in short, are the limits to evolution?
The theory is inadequate because it is not predictive. It explains what has evolved, but not what will. There are simply too many possible streams, and there's no saying which will be chosen. We can only follow the journey and reconstruct the route once it's done. But must it always be so? Compare Darwin's theory of evolution to Newton's account of the planetary motions. Newton, after all, gave us a celestial mechanics, a mathematical theory that enables us to make predictions far into the future.
Darwin did nothing of the kind. But can we, perhaps, make a predictive theory of evolution? Can we compute the future of life?
Many would say no. The evolution of life, they say, is ruled by chaos and contingency. Perhaps evolution is like the weather. Given enough data and computing power, forecasters can tell us whether or not it will rain on the weekend.
The first one being this big lump of cloud.
But ask them about a month of Sundays and their predictions fall apart,
Has issued a tornado warning.
defeated by imperfect data and the chaos concealed in their own equations. And yet, I still think a predictive theory of evolution might be possible. And the reason I do is because of the fish in Lake Malawi. 2 million years of evolution have produced 600 species of cichlid here and an astonishing diversity of form. But what's even more remarkable is that this great evolutionary experiment is not. Scarcely tell what the weather will be 3 weeks from now. We can predict, at least probabilistically, what the climate will be 3 centuries hence. I think evolution is like that. As we explore the internal geometry of living things, I think we'll discover that there are deterministic laws that impose order upon the capricious designs of natural selection and that limit the paths of evolution. And when we discover those laws, we'll be able to construct a predictive theory of evolution. We'll be able to complete Darwin's great project. We'll explain life itself.
There is grandeur in this view of life, with its several powers having been originally breathed into a few forms or into one. From so simple a beginning, endless forms most beautiful and most wonderful have and are being evolved. That is how the origin ends, and it is how our science begins.